you've got to give. All right, I'm going to call us to order. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Finley, and I'm chairman of the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission. With me this morning are 6 of our 7 commissioners. Commissioner Woolley is excused for personal business. And I want to welcome 2 of our new commissioners, Mary Wall and Bob Spellbrink. We're happy to have you. And why don't you share just briefly, starting with you, Mary, what you put on the form, in your interest form, why you wanted to be on the commission. Pull your mic down.
It would probably be way too long a story. I don't remember all of the reasons, but it fits really well, I think, with everything I've done for the last 35 or 40 years in terms of work. So.
Okay. Bob?
I guess, fish and wildlife been a huge part of my life. I commercial fish for over 40 years and been a sport fisherman guide. So anyway, just time to give back, I think, a little bit here.
Well, good. Well, thank you both. Commissioners, anything right off the top that I need to know or we should talk about, just very briefly, before I turn it over to the director? Okay. Director Melcher?
Well, thank you, Chair Finley, and my sincere welcome as well to Commissioner Wall and Commissioner Spellbrink. Really appreciate your interest and your willingness to serve in this capacity. I did want, Mr. Chair, if you could indulge me for just a minute before I go into the formal director's report. As has been the tradition for about the last 10 years, on a commissioner's last meeting, I have a little gift that I would like to present to Commissioner Akinson, and this is, in fact, Commissioner Akinson's last meeting. So I wanted to present that to her and then just also publicly thank her for her 8 years of distinguished service. I really, have appreciated working with her over these last 8 years, both as the director and the deputy director. So with that, Mr. Chair, I wanted to make a presentation.
Okay, please do.
Holly, Commissioner Akinson, I of course have the traditional bottle of Oregon Conservation Cuvée, which is produced by Duck Pond Cellars, and of course, as you know, $5 from the sale of each of these bottles is donated to the department's Habitat Conservation Program. This is, I couldn't remember which events you had judged on, so I was trying to make
I like them all.
So I was trying to make a guess.
The bumblebee's not out yet, is it?
It's not, but this is the turtle edition. So I want to present you with that.
Excellent.
And then we have, at the department, we have a belt buckle that's a service buckle. It goes to employees who have served at their recognized service dates, if they so choose. And I have one here that's in a shadow box made of barn boards from my barn. There's not many boards left. It's mostly on the ground now. And the backing is elk hide from a spike elk that was harvested in the Ukiah unit.
Perfect.
So I want to present that with you. It comes, as I've told others, it comes with a lifetime warranty. So if the box fails, you can send it back and I'll fix it.
Let's go. Thank you.
That is a beautiful buckle. I think it's going to outdo Mr. Akinson's buckle by any measure, huh?
Yeah.
And Mr. Chair, we of course are working on going away celebration for Commissioner Akinson, as well as for yourself, who we think will be off here in several months, as well as Commissioner Buckmaster. So, but this isn't your last meeting, so you have to wait for your buckle.
Okay.
With that, Mr. Chair, I'd go into the formal director's report then. We did produce field reports for you in written form. I have, I believe, Erica Kleiner in the room. There she is, to give you an expenditure report as well as an update on our budget. I know I've been providing you brief updates, but Erica is here to provide another.
Good morning, Chair Finley and members of the Commission. For the record, I'm Erica Kleiner, Deputy Director for Administration. So I'm going to start with the financial report. We are nearing the end of the last quarter of the biennium. So in alignment with the past 2 years of the biennium, expenditures continue to track very closely to revenue. No surprises here. It's been a very steady biennium, and it continues to be. For cash flow, our cash balance, although it continues to fluctuate a little bit given the nature of that balance, continues to be very strong. So as of May 1st, we have over $40 million of our unrestricted cash balance. So a very healthy place to be. I think you all remember we kind of bottomed out in the 2013-2014 timeframe. We've been very motivated this session, just as we were last session, to recommend that decision makers keep that balance intact as much as possible. For other funds revenue, it's been a very strong year. So revenue from hunter and angler license and application fees, I wanted to kind of do a debrief since we just got through our controlled hunt deadlines. So we sold just over 461,000 big game controlled hunt tags in 2019. This is a 1.4% increase in total tag sales above 2018. ODFW internet sales have more than tripled, so we just hit 42% of, for the sales channel, our sales have been online. So just to give some context, point of sale agents represent 53% of our sales, so we're getting really close to tipping that balance. For federal funds revenue, we are in the process of looking at particularly the sport fish restoration funds and preparing for next biennium. So more to come on federal funds as we transition into the new biennium. In terms of budget development, it's been an exciting week. I know you've received some email recaps from Director Melcher. So our budget bill, Senate Bill 5510, moved out of the Subcommittee on Natural Resources on Tuesday onto the full Joint Ways and Means Committee on Friday, which Director Melcher will be attending. And this is a really good budget for us. Overall, it's a 7.5% increase. Total funds above our 2017-19 legislatively approved budget. In terms of general fund, it's a nearly 19% increase. And those enhancements are represented by the water program, sea lion predation, wolf plan implementation, some steelhead production at Santiam Hatchery, and a comprehensive anti-poaching campaign. We do have some fund shifts in the budget. So we had a fund shift from lottery fund of about 1.8 million, from general fund to lottery fund. And then we also have some fund shifts from general fund onto other funds. And most notably, that's a portion of the general fund for Bandon Hatchery and all of the general fund for the North Nehalem Hatchery. And additionally, we have a fund shift from general fund to other funds for a few wildlife positions and a few of the wildlife programs as well. Lastly, for budget, I wanted to announce that we have a new budget manager. His name's Matthew Ader. He came to us from Oregon State Police. He just started this week. So in addition to providing leadership for the Management Resources Division, Matt's going to be supervising the day-to-day activities of our budget services staff. And that's the team that handles the development and monitoring of the technical aspects of our budget. So for an audit update, I also wanted to let you know we have a new chief audit executive. His name's Michael Campbell. He comes to us from the Department of Revenue, where he served as one of two chief audit executives over there. He's also familiar with ODFW and that he served as an external member of our audit committee for 2 years. And Michael has certifications both in internal audit and risk management. So Michael's working on the risk assessment process for fiscal year 2020. So whatever he comes up with for risk, he'll be presenting to the audit committee for approval. And then next, we're gearing up for another Title VI audit. I believe that starts next month, and the focus is on equal access to our programs, services, activities, and facilities. And then finally, an update on the wildlife and sports fish restoration audit. We will have a report ready before the end of the 2019 calendar year. As a reminder, this audit was aimed at program efficiencies, potential for fraud, financial integrity, and then also compliance with the federal rules and laws. So we had an exit conference back in March. We gave some feedback to the auditors at that conference, and some additional need for additional testing came out of that. So it's taking a little bit longer than expected. And with that, I'll open it up for any questions.
Commissioners, any questions? All right. Very good job as usual. Thank you very
Thank you.
much, Erica.
Thanks, Erica. And as Erica mentioned, our budget bill is scheduled for tomorrow at Ways and Means. It's scheduled at 9 a.m. We're fairly early in the agenda, but then at the, I think, second to the last item of the agenda is House Bill 2829, which is the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund, which future Commissioner Labhart has been working on. And so tomorrow morning I will be leaving this seat for Shannon Hearn to staff as I sit in the full Ways and Means in case there's questions.
Commissioner Lappart, would you please stand up and take a bow?
Yes, he is here.
Thank you for coming.
Next up, Mr. Chair, we have an emerging issue related to whale entanglement in commercial crab pot buoy lines, and so I have Dr. Karen Braby and others here to give you a brief update. This is something that will be coming before you for rulemaking at some time in the future. Karen and Kelly Corbett.
Thank
I
you.
got her name right too.
Thank you, Chair Finley, Director Melcher, Commissioners. My name is Karen Braby. I'm the manager of the Marine Resources Program for ODFW, and I have with me our crab manager, Kelly Corbett. I am going to be talking to you today about this emerging issue, and it relates both to the risk of whale entanglements, the observed whale entanglements on the West Coast, as well as steps that we're taking in our crab fishery, both to talk about the issue and plan next steps on how to minimize this risk. So I have, even though Director Melcher said I have a brief presentation for you, which I will try to adhere to, there is a lot of information that I'm going to go over today, and the intent here is to start to familiarize you with what is happening, what we're planning, with a preview of some potential regulatory packages that we'll be bringing to you over the course of the next couple of years. So I'll start with describing what we're seeing, both in terms of entanglements as well as whale distribution crab fishing effort. I'll describe to you again, remind you what our regulations look like now and how those help us reduce the risk of whale entanglements. And then the more recent conversations that are specific to and intended to address whale entanglements, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from fleet perspective, and the conversations we've been having in Oregon to address this. Addressing it is developing mitigation measures, and those mitigation measures fall into two different categories. One is to reduce the risk, and really by this is kind of shorthand for separating crab gear or any kind of fishing gear from where whales are. So this is a complex, it's a very simple statement, but it's a very complex thing to implement. And in order to do that effectively, we need to understand how fishing gear, how crab gear and whales are overlapping. And so that's really the second sub-bullet, is we need to learn from every single entanglement event the most that we can so that we can strategically address that particular part of the problem. So I'll go through all of this today. So first, we'll start with what we've observed with whale entanglements. This is across the West Coast, not just Oregon. And this timeline on the x-axis goes from 2000 to the close of last year, 2018. And I want you to see a couple of patterns here. One is that we've had whale entanglements in gear for, and not just fishing gear, but just gear generally, for a long time now. It's not just the past 18 years even, it goes back beyond this. But that The entanglements that have been observed have been at a fairly low level up until about 2014. And in 2014, and then even more so in 2015, we saw a dramatic increase in the observance of entanglements. And in particular, I want you to pay attention to the light blue bars, which are the humpback whales, and they will play a very important role in this conversation today. So we had a very large increase in humpback entanglements. The gray bars are for gray whales, and that rate has been relatively constant over this time. If we look at that data by month and look at when these entanglements are observed, not when they're happening, but when they're observed, you see that observations are occurring throughout the year from January through December. So this is not something that we can look at happening just in 1 month of the year. This is something that's happening all the time. But there is a peak. There's a modulation where there's an increase in observations in March, kind of gets to what you might call a peak from April through September, April through October. And so there is this presumption that this is when the entanglements are happening. That's why we're seeing them during those months, and that this is a period of time when we would have the best opportunity to find solutions to address the issue. This graph is a pie chart of all of those entanglements that we've observed and how we can attribute them to particular human activities. And I've already mentioned fisheries is a big part of it, but there's other ways that ropes and gear can get in the ocean and can cause problems for marine mammals and other species. From this pie chart, what I would like you to focus on first is that over half of the entanglements are not attributable, meaning we don't know where the gear came from. We don't even know if it's fishing gear. Of the other half, or just under half of the entanglements that are observed, we have fisheries. We have one wave buoy, but generally the other half is fisheries. Right, so half of it's unidentifiable, half of it's fisheries. Of the total pie chart, a third of those entanglements are attributed to crab fishing. So crab fishing is a big part of the picture that we know is happening, and we can attribute it to that activity, which means that is an area where we have an opportunity to change what we're doing and have a positive impact on entanglements. The entanglements are happening with gear from Washington, from tribal activities, from Oregon fisheries, from California fisheries. So it's across the whole space where this fishing is happening. You also, before I leave this slide, will notice that there is a large slice of the pie that is attributed to California fisheries, and there is a specifically very high rate of observation in California that will also come into play in this conversation. But if we focus on the fewer entanglements that have occurred or have been observed in Oregon and have confirmed Dungeness crab gear as part of that entanglement, you can see if you look across the years, they've been happening 1 or 2 a year or none a year for a couple of decades. And then if you look by month, we don't span January to December, but we do span observations in Oregon from April to October. So it's a broad expanse of the year in Oregon. Jumping back up to the top graph, though, I'd like you to notice the difference between the gray whales, the gray bars, and the light blue bars, which are the humpback whales. And what we've seen is that since 2010, we've seen humpbacks starting to enter the story for Oregon. And I'll move into why that's important next. So of the entangled whales off of Oregon, we have 2 species, 3 groups of those 2 species. And they fall into the gray whale category and the humpback category. And as you all know, the gray whale story is a really positive one where the whale population was driven far down, and it has rebuilt and is quite healthy at this point. And this is the large population of gray whales that migrate to summer feeding grounds in Alaska and to winter breeding grounds in Mexico. We see these whales generally when they're migrating between those two areas, and they stop along the way and forage, but basically they're migrating through. There's a much smaller group of gray whales off of our coast, which we call the resident feeding group. There's a lot of different names. It's not exactly an accurate name for them, but it's a smaller population that doesn't migrate as far, that does spend more time foraging in Oregon waters at a greater period of the year. Then we have the humpback whales, and if you see a humpback whale off of Oregon, it could be from one of three populations. The most healthy, largest population is the population that breeds in the Hawaiian Islands, and we see it in Oregon when it's foraging in our waters. A second group, which is as abundant in numbers as that Hawaii group in Oregon waters, is the population that breeds in Mexico. This species is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Then a much smaller but still present population is the population of humpback whales that breeds off the coast of Central America. And this group of whales is listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So if you go off of our waters and you see a humpback whale, it could be one of any of those three, and it could be from a stock that's very healthy, from one that's not doing so well, and one that is really depleted. When there is take of ESA-listed species, it is in violation of the Endangered Species Act. And on the basis of that discrepancy, the Center for Biological Diversity filed a lawsuit against the California Department of Fish and Wildlife 2 years ago. And that lawsuit was settled in March of this year. So on the basis that the department was allowing a fishery to be prosecuted and knowingly taking ESA-listed species and not taking sufficient steps to address the problem, that lawsuit ended in a settlement agreement. And the fishery was closed as a result many months early, as of April 15th this year. The agency in the California Department is currently developing a set of management measures that are consistent with the settlement agreement and that will plot their management measures moving forward. They have a deadline of May of next year to present those management measures to the public and to NOAA, to NIMFs, who are the keepers of the ESA-related issues relative to the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So I'd like to talk about the incidental take permit process that they are undergoing, both as part of the settlement agreement and to bring that fishery into compliance with the Endangered Species Act, and how that has a nexus with us here in Oregon. So in April of this year, joining both California and the state of Washington, Oregon has indicated to NIMFs that we are intending to apply for an incidental take permit for our Dungeness crab fishery to bring it into compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And it's not just a simple matter of bringing it into compliance, and it's not the point, really, of pursuing that, although it's an important step. The point is to have management measures that are reducing the risk of entanglement and having a fishery that is part of the solution rather than just part of the problem here. And so the incidental take permit has a very large component of it, which is the habitat conservation plan. And that conservation plan is the vessel or the house for all of the mitigation measures that the state is undertaking, or that the activity is undertaking or plans to undertake. And so as we're talking about management measures that we want to take in the state to separate crabs and whales, to minimize the risk of entanglements, that will be one of the ways that those management measures will move forward in terms of consideration and management. You, the commission, are the other way that those measures will move forward in terms of state regulations to reflect those intents. It is not a simple process to ask for and get an incidental take permit. It's something that takes many years, and we anticipate it'll take at least a year to develop the application itself, and then multiple years for it to be considered and determined by NIMS. So we will be doing that. We will be having those conversations and moving towards that application. We will be talking to you at the same time. So part of the Habitat Conservation Plan is describing what we do now, what it is that we're doing in a particular activity, in this case the crab fishery, and how that either contributes to or minimizes the take of endangered species. So this is a series of management measures. I'm not going to go into these individually, that we already have in place in Oregon that increase our accountability relative to information about the crab fishing activity, reduce the amount of gear in the water, active gear in the water, and we've done that through things like pot limits, and then also reducing the amount of derelict fishing gear that's in the water, and we've done that in a number of ways through derelict gear program improvements. Another portion of the Habitat Conservation Plan is talking about what we're going to do specific to the issue at hand. And for that, that is the mitigation measures or the management measures. And here, this table just outlines really briefly things that we've been for the last 10 years or so. At the beginning, it was largely about trying to understand the information we had to bring to bear on this decision-making issue, understanding where the crab fleet was fishing, understanding where the whales were coming into Oregon waters, trying to get a handle on that. And we've been collaborating with NIMS on that and the fleet, as well as researchers. Then more recently than that, starting in 2017, we started having serious convenings, both led by Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission and then by Oregon Sea Grant in the state, to bring together industry, managers, researchers, environmentalists to talk about the problem and potential solutions. And of particular centrality to that is the Oregon Whale Entanglement Working Group, which has been convening since 2017. Kelly Corbett has been our representative on that group during that time. And then since last year in particular, and kind of overlapping with this working group process, the agency, me and my staff have been talking with the fleet specifically about management measures with the fleet through a number of different venues, including our annual crab newsletter, through public meetings and other outlets to try and raise awareness. But I want to focus on a couple of ways that the working group in particular has been really valuable to have in Oregon, and some of the outcomes of the discussions of that group. So first, we have developed through that group best management practices, and this flyer depicts one communication of those best management practices. And this was important both to have a conversation to develop what those best practices are, and then to actually commit to sharing those and sharing information more broadly about how to report entanglements and how to avoid them. One of the central tenets of thought about reducing risk is reducing lines and reducing slack lines. And so the picture at the bottom of the flyer here shows a taut line as well as a slack line. And the presumption is that the whales are getting entangled through their pectoral fins, around their mouth as they're feeding, and then also on their caudal or tail fin fluke as they're swimming through the water. So taut lines the thought is, can contribute greatly to minimizing that risk. Another way that the working group has been instrumental is bringing together folks to kind of focus in on the fact that we need better resolution information about where whales are in Oregon. Kelly and a researcher from Oregon State University, Lee Torres, partnered on a grant proposal with NIMS that was funded. Preliminary work on this project was funded by the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission, committing significant funding to this, and this project is really to do monthly surveys over the course of 3 years of time to identify what species and where whales are. This is being done in collaboration with the Coast Guard, who are letting the researchers fly along on their daily training flights across the coast, and so it's really a great project from a lot of perspectives. Additionally, it's not just going to tell us where the whales were in this 3-year period of time, but the whale distribution is going to be paired with environmental information so that we know why the whales are there at that period of time, so that we can use that information about the environment to project in the future where they are. This is of critical importance because one of the factors that we think is increasing entanglements is the change in the environment, changing ocean conditions, and the changing behavior, both migrating and foraging behavior of the whales. All things equal, we think that is going to continue to change with climate change and changing ocean conditions. A third way that the working group has been instrumental is soliciting input from the fleet. And this is a somewhat complex picture. I'll tell you the patterns I want you to look at and how we are thinking about this particular survey. On the left-hand side is a set of management measures, 8 different choices, and these include accountability measures and pot reduction measures. And this survey was sent out to the fleet at wide, I can't remember what the response rate was, 20%, 30, something like that. So it's a fairly high, for a survey, that's a fairly high response rate. And in the bars to the right, you see colors, and the red is strong opposition to a management measure, and blue is strong support of a management measure. So you see a lot of red and you see a lot of blue, but you also see a lot of orange, yellow, and green. And it's across these management measures as well as within the option of having no change to the fishery at all. And so this is difficult to interpret because it doesn't indicate a really strong support for any one action in terms of the crab fishery management in order to address the problem. Instead, we have a divided fleet. We have a lot of dissension about what would be effective, what the fleet could live with, and how to move forward. So that's the context in which we are bringing potential recommendations to you for decision making on how to move forward with the state. And those state measures will be part of our discussion with NIMS and the Protected Resources Division for our incidental take permit process. The first phase of regulatory measures we'll bring to you will be this fall. In September, Kelly Corbett will be bringing a regulatory package to you at the Gold Beach meeting. And this phase 1 of regulatory measures will include a control date of last year. And this is with the intention that at some point in the future, we may want to have additional limited entry provisions to control crab fishing effort. We don't know what those are. We don't know that we're going to go there, but we want a control date to just say fishing behavior from 2018 prior is what we're going to look at in terms of what's fair in limiting entry moving forward. The other measures are really accountability measures and information measures. It includes a mandatory requirement for electronic tickets, and you know that we have been tracking harvest area for biotoxins, and we have a harvest area requirement for fish tickets. Here we'll have an electronic requirement, so we'll have much better near real-time information about who is fishing where. So if we need to close an area or we need to understand real-time where fishing is happening relative to some pod of foraging whales, we'll have that information. Buoy color and pattern registration, double-sided buoy tags, recreational gear marking, fixed gear generally, gear marking, that's all to understand more about every entanglement that we observe. And then the seventh provision that we may bring to you in the fall is a proposal to eliminate the 2-week gear cleanup period after the season ends. That's when you can't retain crab from the pods, but you have some time to get the gear out of the water. This provision is it's not part of either California or Washington regulations, and we are figuring out whether this is a viable approach for Oregon. Phase 2 of our regulatory packages will follow fall meetings. We're going to have another set of fall meetings this October. It'll be about a year since our last set of meetings with the fleet in various ports on the coast. And this will be the regulatory package that will really address some kind of provision to reduce effort, reduce pots, reduce lines in the water in some way. This is where we really need additional thinking and input and commitment from the fleet on what's going to work in order to minimize that risk. So we anticipate that we would have what I'm calling here a late season limit. Wouldn't be by a limited entry system. It would just be across the board. Every permit at some period of the year would be limited, be below the current 200, 300, or 500 pot tiers. And that in order to participate in that late season fishery, that you would have an additional buoy tag that would identify it as a late season pot. So this would both help with enforcement, but it would also help us understand when the entanglements are happening. So it's informational as well as controlling effort. The other thing that we are talking about pursuing, or we're planning on pursuing, is changing the derelict gear authorization from the legislature in order to change the definition so that we can have derelict gear removal similar to our post-season program, but have it start whenever this late season period kicks in. And so we will be considering whether to pursue a legislative concept and change that statutory authorization. Then the third area is fairly vague in the description here, but really what this is thinking about how we structure our season opening and trying to get the fishing initiated during the winter months when we think there are fewer whales, fewer entanglements occurring. And what we've seen in the last few years is that our season opening has been delayed because the meat quality hasn't been sufficient, because we've had biotoxins present, and trying to manage those issues so we can get the fishery open when we have the greatest amount of pots, the greatest amount of gear, and the greatest amount of economic benefit in terms of dollar for dollar from the crab fishery. So trying to address that through our season opening protocols to maximize that period of time. So before I move on to the last phase, which is indeterminate at this point, I did want to pause on this concept of a late season effort reduction. And I alluded that we really need input from the fleet on this. These two graphs describe how effort changes through the season. It starts in March. So we've had season openers in December, we've had season openers in January, and we've had season openers in February. And that first month of fishing is unlike the rest of the season. It's just massive effort, huge amount of pots. And so the more trending information is from March on. That's when we know the fishery is open. We can kind of see what that decline looks like. And ideally, we would have a big jump down in effort at some point, and we'd say, okay, that's the late season. That's probably the time when it would be a good time to kind of, make a change. But in fact, we have a steady decrease in permits that are being used, and we have a steady decrease in our estimation of the number of pots in the ocean. And this is all across the period of time when we see this increase in entanglements observed and increase in whales in Oregon. So we'll be trying to figure this out over the next year, come up with a strategy that makes sense biologically relative to the whales and one that minimizes economic impact given our needs to protect whales for the fleet. So finally, I have two additional items. One I haven't talked about, which is near-time vessel monitoring requirement. And this is something we've been talking about since we've asked you to implement measures for biotoxin management, since we've added harvest areas to our fish tickets for that activity and for biotoxins. But also, we need to have a way of confirming where the fishermen are fishing, both for biotoxins and for whale management. And so we're looking into and testing devices that are much less expensive than the devices that are used, for example, in the groundfish fishery right now. And that have worked very well in some research studies to identify vessel location. And then I've already talked to you about the potential for a late season limited entry system and the reason that we're asking for a control date from you this fall. And then there's everything else that we haven't thought of yet that we might be considering to try and implement. If it's a successful strategy to separate crab gear and whales and reduce entanglements, then we will be adaptively thinking about how to do that over many years to come. So to summarize, this is what we're doing and what we will be asking of you or recommending to you as we move forward. First, for this season, we are considering whether there are any actions that we can take this particular season before September to make a positive impact. So we're considering whether to eliminate the 2-week postseason period for this season. As I mentioned before, neither Washington nor California have this cleanup period. The second thing we will be doing is talking more about gear marking methods and requirements. We have started that conversation relative to sport marking. Sport gear marking occurs in Washington and California. In September, we will bring you our phase 1 measures. We'll have our public meetings in October, and then next February or March is our intent to bring the second phase regulatory package to you with serious considerations for limiting effort, limiting lines in the water. Concurrently, we'll be working with NIMFS as well as Washington and California. The 3 states are committed to coordinating and trying to collaborate as much as possible on our incidental take permit applications, recognizing that in the end, the state would be permitted and the state would have a take allowance for ESA-listed whales, not the West Coast. But as much as we can collaborate on information going into that process, the better. And then the last is everything else. So thank you for your attention and letting me kind of walk you through this problem, what we're thinking about it, what we're planning on bringing to you for decision making and consideration. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Commissioner Buckmaster.
Thank you for the presentation. First off, when you look at the suite of actions and the schedule, do you have what is your degree of confidence that will stave off a lawsuit similar to what we've seen in California?
Thank you, Chair Finley, Commissioner Buckmaster. I think that that is an impossible question to answer. I do not have a degree of confidence in it, and I think I've spent moments kind of flip-flopping on how I feel about all of this as an individual and as a manager responsible for setting the course forward. And this is where I am today. It does matter that we have this threat of lawsuit, but it doesn't matter. And what we really need to focus on is doing the right thing for the whales and for the crab fishery, and that will set our course. Hopefully that will be enough to stave off a lawsuit, and hopefully it will be enough to get an incidental take permit so that we can be in compliance with the ESA. So that is that answer. As we know, California is under lawsuit and Washington is currently under threat of lawsuit from CBD and actively talking with them. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife as yet has not had direct communication on this issue with CBD.
Well, I would hope that CBD would look at this, and I don't know if we can communicate prior that, to get their support. I agree with you on it being the right thing to do regardless. So my other question, quick question, is it appeared to me that the charts on West Coast must include Alaska. Is that correct?
No, it does not.
These are just the California, Washington, and Oregon entanglements on the West Coast.
Where would we have gillnet entanglements in that?
There,
Puget Sound?
thank you, Chair and Commissioner. Yes, Puget
Has to
Sound
be
is the
Puget Sound.
purported, but it hasn't been attributed to that fishery either. But yes, that's the presumed source of that one entanglement.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right, thanks.
Yeah.
Commissioner Wall.
Thank you, Karen. A couple questions. The first one is, could you give a couple examples or say a little bit more about what the environment and ocean conditions are that are that you think might be causing entanglements?
Thank you, Chair and Commissioner, for that question. It's a great question. And so what we have observed with humpback whales in particular is that they have had a foraging shift from krill to anchovy in some cases, and presumably there are other foraging target shifts that are occurring, and that likely has to do with the temperature and salinity and oxygen, ocean acidification, all of those forces on the forage populations themselves. And the whales are going where they can eat, where they can forage and be successful. And so it's very complex what the set of factors are likely that are changing that. And so the bottom line is that we know that their foraging behavior has changed. We know they're foraging on different things in different places than they were, say, 10 years ago. And so that's the assumed mechanism that's kind of bringing them in line. There is one other thing I'd like to point to, and maybe I should go back all the way back to the beginning, to this initial jump in entanglements observed. And that coincides with the marine heat wave, also known as the blob, that hit us in 2014 and 15. We had a big jump in entanglements as well. And we had an increase in harmful algal blooms. We had changes in the chemistry of the water. We had changes in the temperature of the water. So all of these things were happening simultaneously to really force changes in the forage as well as where the whales were. And then finally, in terms of human activities and interactions with the environment, what happened in 2015 was that the Dungeness crab fishery in California was delayed because they had such excessive levels of biotoxins in a variety of harvested species. So they waited and they waited and they waited for the biotoxins to clear, and then opened the crab fishery at the same time that that peak in humpback whale presence occurred. And so that was initially thought as being the reason that our entanglements went so high. And while we've had delays in the fisheries since then, it hasn't been as dramatic, and we're still seeing this big increase in entanglement. So it's not just a delayed season relative to biotoxins. It's much more complex than that.
Thank you.
Yep.
One more.
Yep.
Thank you. The survey that you mentioned, could you just say who was surveyed? Was it the industry? Was it the industry and the public in terms of which methods will work?
Thank you, Chair and Commissioner, for that question. And you're talking about this graph.
Yes.
And if I wasn't clear, I apologize. I don't think I actually was, but it was a survey of industry. It was permit holders. And so it was a willingness to consider management measures to curtail their own permit and their own fishery. Thank you.
Commissioner Atkinson.
On the topic of eliminating the 2-week cleanup period, is that concern related to the month in which that occurs that's a higher risk month for entanglement?
Thank you, Chair and Commissioner Atkinson. That is a period of time when we are more in the peak of whale entanglement observations and whale abundance. And it's, rather than saying it's that 2-week period of time that's the problem, it's just that it's 2 weeks during the season when we aren't harvesting the crab, we're not getting benefit from the gear being in the water. So let's just get the gear out of the water, because every 2 weeks counts in terms of reducing the risk of interaction. And so, along with the fact that the Washington and California fleets do not have that same allowance, and they seem to be operating fine, that's our question to our fleet. Do we really need this, or can we reduce those 2 weeks just as one of the many measures we need to take to reduce the risk?
So they would pull the crab pots on the last day of the fishery.
Commissioner Wall, do you have another one? Okay. Karen, I was curious about something, and maybe I just missed it in your presentation. You indicated that California had a higher number of entanglements. Was that due to different gear configuration, or do you know why they have a higher rate?
Thank you for the question, Chair Finley. There are a number of hypotheses. One is that there are more humpback whales there and more crab gear at the same time. Another is that there are more observers, so whale watching boats, other vessels on the water, and the Monterey Bay area has been a hot spot for observations of entanglements. And as many or all of you know, that is a hot spot for whale watching boats and activities. So there's probably a number of reasons, but it's not a difference in the way the gear is deployed or the configuration of the gear. It's just that location is a bad place for this interaction.
Okay, thank you. All right, great job, thank you.
Very good, Mr. Chair. More to come on that topic, as you'll
Okay.
see. Next up, and not on the agenda, we do have, of course, we have a large number of special guests with us here today, but I wanted to call out one in particular, and that is Buck, the wildlife detection dog, is with us here today. Now, Buck is working with the state police. We want to have an introduction, and of course, Trooper Walcott is his handler down in, I believe, in the Springfield office. But
That's correct.
and this is our first wildlife detection dog, at least first in the modern era. I don't know if there has been any historically, but and this was part of a program that was funded by, at least in part, by the Oregon Wildlife Foundation, formerly known as the Oregon Wildlife Heritage Foundation. And so I wanted to have Captain Thomas and Trooper Walcott come up and say a few words.
Thank you, Chair Finley, Director Melcher, members of the commission. Thanks for having us this morning. As Director Melcher mentioned, this is Buck. He's the newest member of our State Police Canine team. He's assigned to the Fish and Wildlife Division, specifically Trooper Walcott, out of Springfield. And I'll let Josh talk about the training they went through and what Buck can specifically do, but I did also want to reiterate what Director Melcher said, and that we sponsored, we were partnered with the Oregon Wildlife Foundation to sponsor the program in Buck, and we're excited about what he can do. And to my knowledge, it is the first wildlife detection canine in Oregon. And with that, I'll turn it over to Josh to introduce Buck formally to you and explain what he can do.
Thank you. Again, my name is Josh Walcott, and I do work out of Springfield. Canine Buck, we got him in late November, and him and I both went to Indiana for our training. We left the end of January, and were there training off and on in different segments until just about 2 weeks ago, where we graduated there with other game wardens across the country. He is specifically trained in tracking people, whether that's a lost or missing person, hiker, hunter, etc., or whether that's somebody maybe trespassing on private land. He's also trained in wildlife detection, and the easiest way I can explain that is, we have drug canines throughout the state that detect heroin. Does the same thing, but detects illegal wildlife species that we imprint him on. Our goal is to get him to 7 species. Currently, he is imprinted on turkey, venison, and waterfowl, and he's being imprinted with elk. And then we're going to discuss the other species that we're going to imprint him on. And then he also does an area search for evidence related to wildlife crimes. He will detect anything, whether it's a firearm or anything related to a firearm, such as a shell casing or maybe a shotgun wad. And then he'll detect and alert on anything with human scent during that search as well, and alert to that. We've been back once, and he's been deployed once, or we've been back, he's been deployed once the first day. So we're looking forward to the future, and be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Commissioner Buckmaster.
I was also trained in Indiana.
Took longer for you, though.
It didn't take a great deal longer.
It didn't stick.
And not as well. I can only assume that Buck is short for Buckmaster, and I am honored, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
All right. Go ahead, Holly.
Well, I'm really excited to hear about having Buck. It sounds like he'll be a great addition to some new ways to detect problems with poaching and illegal activity. I'm a search dog owner and trainer, and have a certified dog that does air scent and trailing. So I'm really happy to see Buck on your force.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
I had a question. I know you have canines in your traffic unit and sniffing out drugs. Is it your intent to cross-train in any way, or is that just too much for one dog?
Thank you, Chair. Sorry about that. That's going to be, too much for one dog.
Yeah.
So we're just going to strictly focus on our wildlife.
Well, it'll be interesting to see the results.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I can't remember my science on the olfactory level, if anyone can, Holly, or...
Thousands of times better.
Yeah, thousands. I mean, so if you think you're going to outsmart the scenting ability of a dog, it isn't going to happen.
Never.
Okay, thank you, Captain. Thank you, Trooper Wolf.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioners.
Mr. Chair, that brings us to the public forum. We have 3 individuals signed up to speak with you today. First up is Ron Hiort. I'm not sure if he's here. Oh, there he is. He wants to talk to you about Senate Bill 593 as it relates to resident disabled veteran hunting
chair?
licenses.
Any you would like, sir. Okay.
My name is Ron Yort. I live at 2371 Goodrich Highway. I'd like to thank the commissioners for allowing me to speak to you today. I'm a 72-year-old disabled veteran wounded in combat while serving in Vietnam. I have a permanent disability rating of 100% from the Veterans Administration. I hold a permanent hunting and fishing license, excuse me for a little nervous here, for 31 years, and a disabilities permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've lived in Oregon since 1956, entered the Army from Oregon, returned here, and have lived here ever since. In May of 2018, I wrote and asked ODFW about having a pioneer/disabilities license so I could receive controlled hunt points allowed pioneer license holders. I was advised that I would have to surrender my permanent disabilities hunting and fishing license before I could have a pioneer license and receive hunt points, or I could ask the legislature to have it changed. I believed that this was to be unfair, as I cherish my permanent disability hunting and fishing license, and I believed I earned it the hard way, being wounded, and giving it up was not what I believe should happen. Therefore, I wrote to Senator Przansky about having some legislation I believe would correct the situation and allow those of us that are eligible for a pioneer license and possess a permanent disabled hunting and fishing license be allowed to keep our current permanent disabled hunting and fishing license and still be able to earn the same points as a pioneer license holder. Senator Przansky introduced Senate Bill 593 to correct this situation. The bill passed the Senate and the House unanimously and was signed by the governor and is now written into law. I would appreciate your amending the administrative rules to allow the legislation to take effect for the 2020 controlled hunt process. I've attached some simple and short language that would comply with the law as passed in Senate Bill 593. I appreciate your consideration. I hope that this can be accomplished. It's taken me over a year to get this far. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and again, I thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you, sir. Commissioners, any questions?
Mr. Chair, I would just note that, if I might, that yes, Mr. York is correct. Senate Bill 593 has passed and been signed by the governor. It is now an enrolled bill. Its effective date is January 1 of 2020. And as we've done in the past, you'll see sometime this fall or early winter, we will be coming to you with the rules to implement the law, which becomes effective in January. So just want to follow up on that. And
Thank you.
thank Mr. York for being here and for your service especially.
Thank you.
You may want to volunteer your time to help us on things if you can get it done in a year. And thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, next up under the public forum is Craig Starr.
Chair Finley, Commissioners, Director Melcher, my name's Craig Starr. I live at 2105 Desiree Place in Lebanon, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to comment to you this morning. Before I address the tag issue that I want to talk to you about, in the interests of complete disclosure, I've been friends with Ron York for about the last 35 years, and I strongly urge you to progress as expeditiously as possible to implement Senate Bill 593. With regard to the tag issue, I recently purchased 2019 turkey and controlled angling tags, and I was struck again by the high cost of those tags. I believe the cost of both of those tags are really related to relics from the past, when turkey hunting, for example, was an extremely rare opportunity, only by controlled hunt and only up in the White River area near Mount Hood. And with respect to the combined angling tag, from a day when salmon and steelhead were, including wild fish, were quite plentiful, and a 20 fish tag made reasonable sense. I think both tags are overpriced now for the value that sportsmen and sportswomen receive from purchasing these tags. I would urge you to consider making the following changes. Number one, reduce the cost of the turkey tags. Far from being a rare experience of years ago, now a person can hunt 5 turkeys a year, maybe more, I don't know, but at least 5. And turkeys are frequently a nuisance. So I think a tag, in particular, around $10 to $15 makes more sense than the $25.50 today. With regard to the combined angling tag, I don't understand why I have to pay for a tag that includes halibut and sturgeon when I've never fished for either of those species, and my only interest is salmon and steelhead. I think the tags ought to be separated. And number 3, I think you should consider offering a new reduced catch salmon and steelhead tag for the more casual angler, especially in today's environment where conservation of our wild salmon and steelhead is paramount, and there's rare opportunity to fish for them and keep one. A reduced catch tag would seem to make good conservation sense. I appreciate the opportunity to make my comments. Thanks.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Starr. By the way, come to my yard anytime you want. I have 22 turkeys in there, and you can have them for nothing.
What's your address?
Bring your net gun. Commissioners, any questions or comments? Okay, thank you very much for coming.
Mr. Chair, the last individual signed up under public forum is David Moskowitz.
Welcome, Mr. Moskowitz.
Thank you, Chair Finley, members of the commission. If I could maybe make a comment without the time going, just wanted to thank Commissioner Atkinson for her service and passion on being on the commission, and enjoyed working with you very much. And also just wanted to say welcome to Commissioner Spellbrink and Commissioner Wall, and looking forward to getting to know you. My name is David Moskowitz, and I'm with the Conservation Angler, and reside 3241 Northeast 73rd Avenue in Portland, 97213. And I want to talk today about the one of the administrative rules that you are poised to adopt, a temporary rule regarding a change in Columbia River fishing regulations for barbed hooks. We commend the work of the Bi-State Committee looking at Columbia River fisheries reform. However, we believe that WDFW acted prematurely to change the hook regulations as a result of that commission effort, that joint commission effort. The issue of sport fishing regs, we believe, should be dealt with in the regular standard regulation review process. And one issue of particular note is that there was not an opportunity to comment on the use of barbed hooks versus barbless during that Bi-State Committee. There was, as everyone knows, there was going to be that opportunity yesterday before that topic was pulled. But the rule, so there's been, and it's an issue of great public interest, and the fact that there was not a chance for the public to comment and review is significant. We also believe that it was out of the scope of the committee based on the review of Senate Bill 830 that dealing with that issue was not necessarily specifically part of the fisheries reform review. But for those two process issues, we think that that was a premature decision, and we'd like that Oregon to take a different tact. But on the conservation side, on the science side, the 2018 U.S. v. Oregon Fishery Management Agreement, which sort of governs how fisheries are conducted in the Columbia River, is largely driven by the Technical Advisory Committee to that body. And they have developed a mortality rate table that assigns mortality rates to different fishery activities, including barbed or barbless hooks. And based in that agreement, there is based on science, there's a 2% difference in mortality between barbed and barbless hooks. the fisheries that are authorized or have been considered by Oregon and Washington are modeled on specific actions within the forecast and the fishery days, the angler days, and also gear type, which includes barbed or barbless hooks, and that analysis does not appear to have been done. So these fisheries are not, we believe, are not, or this change for the sport fishing, we believe did not follow proper procedure. Because not completing that analysis means you don't know what the impacts are. Are you going to reach your ESA limits if you allow barbed hooks? Because there's increased mortality. And the reason that's important is because the runs continue to come in low. The forecasts have been, they've been not necessarily on target. And in the early season fishery in particular, because there's not going to be summer steelhead or summer Chinook fishing, there's not going to be sockeye fishing. The early season fishery is based on steelhead, which has a two fish bag limit in the first part of the season. And the early part of the season is when the wild fish are coming back, the wild steelhead. And if you look at the past 3 years, the percentage of wild fish of the total run go from 40 up to over 50%.
Okay, David,
okay.
I let you go because
sure.
I wanted the
I see.
commission to hear your last information.
And I appreciate that, and my last sentence would be that we would ask that the commission remove this rule from the consent agenda and reconsider the implementing that rule. And we believe Washington will follow suit. That's been reported in the news, that if Oregon were to not adopt that they would reconsider their decision. And that's what we would urge. And we really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you during this public forum. It's a very important avenue for our conversation, and we do appreciate it greatly.
All right, hang on. Commissioners, any questions, comments? Commissioner Buckmaster?
It comes as no surprise, David, that I don't always agree with your positions. But one of the things I do agree is that your participation, conservation angler, is very important. Any group that is an irritant for both sides of an argument is pretty cool in my book. So I have a little something for you and the conservation angler. 1974, and I wasn't here to stop it, we passed a measure in Oregon making the steelhead a game fish. This is one of the original posters from 1974. The artwork was from Bill Bakke. I'd like to present it to you, a conservation angler, for use it for whatever, and get that thing out of my house.
Yay.
Thanks, David.
I do have some things I'll bring to the next meeting to give to David as well.
I guess my comment quickly would be that this is lovely, but it's not necessarily what we're asking you for right now.
Well, David, you know our policy on
Yes.
public testimony. But we will take this under advisement, and if we made a mistake, we are capable of correcting it. All right, well, thank you for coming and for the write-up.
Mr. Chair, that concludes public forum. You do have 6, I believe, on your TAN agenda, 5 temporary rules that require ratification, which is actually a fairly small number
Yeah.
considering, well, I guess we did have a teleconference in mid-May. I was thinking we hadn't
That's
met
right,
since
we did
April, but
approve, yeah. So, commissioners, I know this was in your packet, well, not on a TAN agenda, but any questions or comments on any of these temporary rules? Commissioner Atkinson?
Yes, I have some comments on temporary rule number 4 for allowing barbless hooks. I support allowing barbless hooks, but that's as part of the by-state recommendation for the Columbia River Fisheries Policy update, but I will vote against this temporary rule. And this is because I'm opposed to the inappropriate way this commission has been denied the opportunity to vote on whether or not to approve the concurrent fishery policy for 2019 that we as a bi-state subcommittee recommended from Oregon and Washington bi-state committee. After several years of non-concurrent fishing regulations in the Columbia River, the commissioners from both states finally got to meet together and negotiate an adaptive management strategy to improve the Columbia River fishery policy and bring the states together in concurrent policy and regulations. I was a member of that subcommittee and spent every other week driving from Eastern Oregon in the winter to meet and negotiate, and it was a long and difficult process, as we all know, for the last 7 years. The Columbia River policy has been a very, very difficult issue to address. Washington's commission immediately approved the recommendations of the bi-state subcommittee for the 2019 fisheries in the Columbia River. Oregon's commission has had the policy on the agenda twice, but has revoked that agenda item twice right before the meetings occurred. It was well known by all involved that a majority of commissioners would soon be replaced. And given the complexity of the fisheries and the comprehensive analysis of the effectiveness of our current policy, that it was imperative to complete the update of the Columbia River's fishery policy before 5 of 7 of our commissioners' positions will be filled by new commissioners. In my 8 years as a Fish and Wildlife Commissioner, I felt that resolving the Columbia River policy would be my most important vote. I was eagerly anticipating that we would follow through with that this spring. Instead, at my last meeting as a commissioner, I've been denied that vote. There's no excuse for the Oregon Commission to avoid our responsibility to implement rules in a timely manner, and this has not been done. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments? Holly, I understand the time and effort, and it's yeoman. While we can't make the vote, we can certainly ask you to come back as a guest of the commission and testify in more than 3 minutes with your background and so forth, with the expenses paid. So I don't know whether you consider that, but your intellectual capacity and your experience is of value. So I don't know if you can think about that, if you will. Commissioner Buckmaster?
I agree wholeheartedly with my colleagues' comments about delaying votes on something that we were asked to do and did. I will actually vote for the item 4, or the temporary rule, because I'm concerned that our delay, our inexcusable delay on voting, and particularly if we reinstitute our barbless hook rule, will send the message that we are not going to concur with Washington. I don't think the barbless hook issue should have ever been in the bi-state plan. It had no business being in there, and getting it out, and I think it deserves the full discussion and vetting that David alluded to or asked for. So I think we should look at that. I think it will come up, but I don't want to send At the last, I don't want to send a message to Washington that we are not going to seek concurrence, something that we agreed on in the work group. And barring barring the chance that we could somehow vote on it at some point in the future. Now, that said, at the last meeting, we asked, or I think I broached the subject and asked if it was a sense of the commission that we wanted our director to use temporary rule to maintain concurrence with Washington, since Washington had voted on the recommendation for 2019. It was a unanimous yes. I think this is a result of that direction at the time. I don't know if I would like him to continue to keep us in concurrence with the decision that the work group made and that Washington is operating under. Chair, does that require an additional direction, or is the previous one still in place?
Well, I think we ought to clarify with an additional one. So if you want to make a motion?
Well, I don't think we can do it as a motion, but I think we can offer direction to the director. We have something on the table. Do we need to address that first and then come back?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I would recommend that you move forward with the ratification of the 5 temporary rules, then you can have some further discussions, as Commissioner Buckmaster indicated.
Okay, well, let's clear the table then. Do I hear a motion? Commissioner Buckmaster.
I'll move to adopt the temporary rules as presented in our packet.
Do I hear a second? Okay, it's been moved by Commissioner Buckmaster and seconded by Commissioner Biddle. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Okay. So it's been approved by the 6 commissioners present, with 5 commissioners present.
No. I think
Excuse me.
there was
I think it
Mine-
was yours.
I'm the same as Holly.
Okay, 2 were. So of the 6, it's 4-2.
Very good.
Okay, so further discussion, Commissioner Buckmaster. I think you want to expand upon your remarks?
Well, only that I would like to reiterate our direction to our instructions to the director that there is, the work group arrived at a recommendation which was voted on and became policy in Washington. There has been emphasis for the last couple of years and one of the emphasis of our work group was to get concurrent. And I would like us to stay concurrent up to and including the time when this commission gets around to voting. So in the meantime, I would like the director to keep using temporary rules to keep us concurrent.
Okay, commissioners, just by a show of hands, indicate whether you agree with that, and that will be the wish of the commission director. Okay. So we have 4. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would just, before we go into the regular agenda, I would like to mention a couple of items, and there is a nexus to this earlier discussion, and that is, when we don't need an answer today, but there are a number of commission member assignments that we will need to reconcile over the next several months. One, of course, is the Fish and Wildlife Commission has a seat on the OWEP board, and Commissioner Buckmaster currently holds that board, so we will need to, the chair will need to reappoint or appoint, a new commissioner to fill the OWEB seat after September 1, I believe. Also, Commissioner Buckmaster serves on our internal audit committee, and so we will need a new volunteer to sit on our internal audit committee after September 1. And then, and I know it's been a lot of discussion, but the Columbia River reform issue is an ongoing issue. It's going to continue for the next 1+ years, I imagine, perhaps longer. The Joint State Columbia River Policy Review Committee, our current 3 members on that committee are Commissioner Weber, Commissioner Aikenson, and Commissioner Buckmaster. So we are in the next, 1 to 2 months, we need to repopulate that committee with commissioners and then also have some opportunity to bring new commissioners up to speed, particularly if they're sitting on that committee. So I mention that not because we need a decision today, but that you all need to be thinking about who's willing to participate. And then I did make note of we'd also want to have the discussion, you make note of the invitation you made to Holly to continue to participate on the PRC, and perhaps that's as one of the members. That's an open question, but certainly I think the commission has the latitude to have whoever they want to sit on the committee in their stead.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to just comment on that last piece. The couple new members coming on as far as working on the work group of the 3, I think is excellent to get people involved. But the continuity, somebody that's been involved in this from the very beginning, the Columbia River issue is critically important. Because there's so much misinformation and mischaracterization on every side of the issue, that having that is, I think, imperative to making a good decision. Consequently, it is my recommendation that the chair would ask Commissioner Aikenson to remain as a voting member on that, one of the 3, on that work group. Moving forward, she would offer a steady hand, a institutional memory, as you mentioned, a great scientific mind, and I would hope that she would accept it if offered, but first it must be offered, and I for one definitely would like to see that happen.
I think you heard me offer it. But I'm going to let Holly think about that. And we'll reconstitute the committee. And so I want the 2 new members present here to think about, those opportunities that they may have, and let me have your interest. And when does Commissioner Labhart come on?
July 1, Mr. Chair.
Okay. So, Mark, I know you have experience in certainly the OWEB stuff, and so let me know also your interests so we can make these new appointments. And thank you, Commissioner Buckmaster. Anything else? If not, we're going to come back at 9:45.